I'm half Navajo and half Mexican. For over 20 years of my life, I've lived on the Navajo Nation reservation in New Mexico. My Native American side of the family always warned us to be careful at night. My grandparents would always tell me stories of these shape-shifting witches who can curse you or mess with you. They called them Skinwalkers, because they would take the skin of animals and wear them to change into that animal, or something in between a human and an animal. I never believed in it, really. I'm only half Navajo and light-skinned, so I was never treated the same by most people here, so I drifted away from the culture and thought it wasn't for me. It was around summertime. This happened when I was in high school, so about 6 to 8 years ago. I would have been like 15 to 17 then. I used to hang out with a group of guys who liked to do a lot of delinquent type stuff. You know, smoke cigs and stay up all night playing video games at someone's house. Then at 3 a.m., if we felt like it, we would go sneak out to Paradise. I know, it's an ironic name. It's basically a giant metal pipe that carries irrigation water to all the farms. But really, it was also a spot for kids to get drunk or high in the evenings. However, the place did have a scary history of kids and adults who drowned in the night. But I always thought those were urban legends. But at 3 a.m., that was our time. We as boys would test one another across the pipe, sort of an initiation, to see how far you could go. We usually could go all the way across. Now keep in mind, this pipe goes well over 3 stories high. It's also wide. I'd say as wide as an average car. We would walk this thing for kicks in a group of 9 at 3 a.m. So one night, me and a small group of friends were driving around bored at 2 a.m., wanting to spook each other. So I said let's go to Paradise and walk the pipe. As to most of these friends I was hanging out with had never done it. They agreed, pumped up on energy drinks, and we drove. It was pretty quiet. The sky was dark and the night was cold. The boys with me were Michael, Cody, Tommy, and Theryl. Now, Theryl was the driver because he had a car and his family was pretty well off too, so he never had to worry about cash. We got to the place and he didn't want to go. Said his parents were traditional, and he wanted to just chill in the car. Basically, he wanted to text some chick, I'm sure, without us bugging him. I told him it's fine, keep the car locked and running in case we see something scary. Me and the other boys went on without him. As we got onto the lead pipe, a few of the guys were scared, and had me take the lead. As we crawled, I'd say 1/4 of the way on the pipe, talking and laughing, I noticed a faint white or light gray bat, bigger than my head, flying around us. It dived for us a few times. We dodged it, but then Tommy slipped because of the shoes he was wearing and almost fell off the pipe. I reached out, grabbing him on his right arm. Michael had grabbed my shirt collar, and Cody grabbed his. Altogether, we got back on the pipe, shaken that we almost lost Tommy to the dark depths below. The bat was gone. We were all freaking out, but the guys wanted to continue. We laughed about it as guys usually do. We passed the halfway point on the pipe with no problems, but as we got 3/4 of the way, Michael saw something. You see, at the end of the pipe there's a hill. Behind that hill, it's very brightly lit because of a church somewhere off in the distance. Anyway, on that hill was a black figure of pointy ears, a dog silhouette. Now, Michael was a tough guy. He yelled at that thing, "I'm not scared of you, Skinwalker," and tossed a few rocks he had in his pocket. One rock hit the pipe and the other fell into the brush below. That shadow silhouette dog stood up on its 2 legs like a person. We all freaked out. Jaws dropped. Then Cody said, "Look, another one to the left." Tommy said there's another one on the right. So there's 3 silhouettes of pointy dog-eared people on the hill. I told them to back up so we could get back to the car. The things to the right and the left of the hill started to move down the hill towards us. Now there's just one standing on the hill, the one who stood up first. Now we're trying to go back, but we're still halfway. Under us, complete darkness. It's quiet for a few minutes. Then we heard a girl crying. Sounded like she was hurt and scared. We were overcome with a strange feeling of wanting to help. Michael wanted to go back towards the end and crawl down the pipe to help this girl. I almost followed too, but inside I said, "No, this is wrong. Something isn't right." So I yelled at him and everyone, saying, "Are you stupid? Look at the thing up there on the hill. Did you not see those things? It's a trap. Let's leave that fake crying. If that girl is hurt, we'll come back when the sun is up in 2 hours." Now, the moment I said this, the crying stopped. All the guys freaked out, saying they can't believe what came over them. They said they almost forgot what we saw before. Halfway on the pipe now, we hear a drum being played. We start running. Running on this pipe, almost to the car, Corey stops us. We can all hear it, and it sounds like a pack of snarling, growling, yelping coyotes. But it's pitch dark below. But we know they are under us. We run, full speed. Not looking back in the car, we yell and drive as fast as we can back onto the dirt road to a well-lit gas station. And explained what happened to Theryl. We couldn't get the girls crying out of our heads, and we went back in daylight just to make sure. We did not find the girl. Instead, in the area, we heard the crying and we saw a coyote watching us a close distance away. It was not shy. It looked at us for 4 seconds and walked into the brush. I did not go back there after that. This was about a year ago. I lived in Michigan. My older brother was planning a big cruise to Mexico and then invited me to go along. I agreed because I'd never left the country before, and I thought it would be a fun trip. So it was a day before the flight, and I went over to my cousin's to sleep, because our flight was very early and I live 40 minutes away. My cousin's backyard is completely woods with a small creek, and it's beautiful down there in the summertime. But it was about March when this happened, so the woods were very bare. It was getting late, and we were all starting to go to bed. I slept in the living room while my cousin went upstairs to bed with her husband and said goodnight. I was up, just facing the window to the woods, because it always takes me a little bit to fall asleep. Then, very faintly, I saw a pair of glowing eyes off in the distance. My mind raced as I told myself it was just a deer, but the glowing eyes were getting closer and closer. Then I realized it wasn't a deer. The thing had to be at least 9 or 10 feet. I was horrified and paralyzed with fear. It looked like a big wolf or deer that had been decaying. The thing went back into the woods. That night I didn't sleep. When it was about 4, I heard my cousin's husband walking down the steps, and I told him about the whole thing that had happened that night. His eyes got very wide and said very quietly, "You seen a skinwalker." I've done some more research about these things, and I do believe I've seen a skinwalker. I never told anyone the story because I felt like I would be called a liar, but that was one of the scariest moments of my life. To start, I'm a white female. I was adopted 7 years ago by my Navajo family, and we've always been close despite my obvious cultural differences. Still, I learned about skinwalkers firsthand, and they've since then become an accepted part of my life. I left Utah at the end of 2012. The first story happened to my adopted uncle. He was driving through the canyon area. They live in Blanding, Utah, a spot not quite notorious for skinwalkers, but full of them nonetheless. It was dark outside, but the moon illuminated the canyon and brush, enough for him to see out of his side vision that something was running across the desert night. He was in his 40s, and at the time, he was a police officer, so a full-grown man. He started singing and praying in Navajo and kept his eyes on the road in front of him, but he was driving at least 55 to 60 miles per hour. So the shape running through the desert was keeping pace with him, despite his high speed. He said that it looked very vaguely human-shaped, but paler than any human that he'd ever seen. Still, he didn't look directly at it, and despite his singing, he was getting more and more scared. One thing my Navajo family always taught me was that these creatures feed on our fear. This one certainly seemed to. My uncle was shaking and sweating when this running thing picked up speed, outpacing his truck, and then it was maybe 30 yards ahead of him. It made a sharp right and began to run towards the road. He knew it was going to directly intersect him, and he made up his mind to put the foot on the gas. So it got closer and he sped up, and just as the two crossed paths, it jumped onto the road. He saw it for the first time then. He described it as a skinny man in jeans, with a plaid shirt, typical reservation wear, with a long face and big yellow eyes that looked like cat eyes. Its arms were thrown up over its head, and its hands were kind of flying behind it. The worst part was its mouth was open and seemed disconnected from its jaw. The chin was just flapping around, about a foot below its nose. It leapt onto the road and just as quickly jumped out of the way of the truck, and he didn't see it again. He prayed the whole way home, and they had a ceremony shortly after that. Another encounter happened to my adopted brother, who was one of the most level-headed and unshakable men I have ever met. He was 30 when this happened. He was at their dad's house, partaking in one of these ceremonies, which happens in a Hogan. The rule is that you never leave the Hogan alone, because the magic and energy that you make in one of those ceremonies is kind of like a supernatural light beacon. You never know what kind of creatures you're attracting. Still, Eric, my brother, was a pretty rational guy and wasn't afraid of the dark. He's been in the Hogan for hours, chanting and praying and all that good stuff. He needed a smoke break and to take a leak. So against the general rule, he edged out of the roundhouse and out into the night. There was nothing around except 15 or 20 parked cars, all close to the ceremony area. It was a large gathering, so Eric did his business with no incident and lit up a cigarette. He was standing there, staring off into space when he got that feeling of being watched. To shake it off, he walked away from the Hogan about 20 feet and scanned the desert. Everything was quiet except drums coming from the back of the tent and singing within. Just as he was about to shrug off his weird feeling and chuck his cigarette butt, he saw it. Under one of the vehicles, a dark shape with 2 shining eyes. The eyes were animal-like. They didn't glow on their own, but had reflective light in them, and they glinted right at Eric. They were yellow. The creature didn't have the shape of any animal he'd recognized, though. He explained it to me that it was shaped like Gollum, really skinny with a round human head. Eric walked towards the vehicle and bent down to get a closer look. Dust scrabbled around and he could hear a skittering noise. One bony arm shoved gravel his way, and the next thing he knew, the creature was gone and the vehicle was empty. But then he smelled this disgusting, puke-worthy stench. And he got scared then, because that's one of the worst things in Navajo culture. Bad smells are treated very seriously when they're assumed to be supernatural. So he straightened back up, and then he realized the source of the smell. A shadow fell over him, covering him from behind. He is around 6'2", so this thing, he said it was at least 7.5 feet. He was shivering and didn't move as it approached him from behind, until it was standing inches away. He could feel it. He could smell it, see its shadow, and then the worst thing, he felt it breathe on his neck. Eric said that it sounded like a horse or a cow when it snorts, and its breath was warm. When he looked at his feet, he saw his shoes, and behind his right foot, a big hoof. So he closed his eyes and started to sing, and right in that moment his dad and uncle got a terrible feeling from inside the Hogan. They bolted up and exited, calling his name. They found him shivering outside, too terrified to talk, and too terrified to stop singing in Navajo. It took Eric months before he shared this with us, and he did so expecting us to laugh or call him crazy, but I completely believe his story.